You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Dankman. The U.S. Forest Service says it's going ahead with a major overhaul of the way it manages the nation's forests. The plans, announced last week, include moving agency headquarters from Washington, D.C. to Salt Lake City, Utah. The Forest Service will close or repurpose its regional offices, including the Pacific Northwest one, and create 15 state offices. It will also close dozens of research facilities. Here to talk about what this means for forests here in the western U.S. is Christine Peterson. She's a writer who covers science, the environment, and outdoor recreation. She's based in Laramie, Wyoming, and wrote about the Trump administration's reorganization of the U.S. Forest Service for High Country News. Christine, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Can we just start with the stakes here, Christine? I mean, for somebody who's not quite sure, what does the U.S. Forest Service do, and what are the biggest issues it is facing right now?
The Forest Service oversees the country's 154 national forests. It is the land management agency that makes all of the decisions based around much of the country's forested land, all of the really the bulk of the public forested land. And national forests are multiple use, and so a lot happens on that. There's often been, has long been a focus on logging and extractive uses, but also a lot of recreation. It's really critical wildlife habitat, all of the things. And the Forest Service has been through a lot of upheaval in the last 5-10 years, and then especially over the last year, there were a lot of cuts. Forest Service lost thousands of employees under the Department of Government Efficiency. And then also just big picture, climate change, drought, mega fires. There's just a lot going on for the Forest Service, and disease. So there's a lot of big picture issues, and then also just a lot going on from the policy administrative side.
Yeah. So now the agency is going to undergo this massive reorganization. What kinds of impacts will it have on day-to-day management of the nation's forest land? Like, what are the biggest changes that we can expect?
Unfortunately, I don't think anyone knows that quite yet. It's really pretty new. The changes that they're looking at making right now are at a lot of it is at the leadership level. So then there's a whole bunch of speculation about what it could mean, and a number of sources I talked to, or longtime retired Forest Service, had worked for many years for the Forest Service, now retired, have said, I don't know yet. Some folks believe that this is really going to break the agency. And now what does it mean to break the Forest Service? At its most apocalyptic, it could mean that it's run less and less efficiently, and eventually the broader public throws up their hands and says, this isn't being done well, and states can do better. And so then there could be this transfer of public lands, which a lot of folks really worry about. But what it means for people who enjoy forests this summer, I don't know. You may not really notice a whole lot, assuming they're staffed up where they should be. Camping, some people told me camping this summer is probably going to be like it is most summers. Campgrounds are going to be okay. But then what it means as far as the next 5, 10, 20 years for forests, that is harder to know.
So from what I can tell from your reporting and just kind of reading some of the news releases that the Trump administration has put out about this, there seems to be this idea that they're moving Forest Service offices closer to the lands that they actually manage. So, moving the headquarters to Salt Lake City, like the western United States obviously has bigger swaths of the national forests and U.S. forest lands. What kinds of things have you heard about the reasoning behind this move, at least on the surface, what the Trump administration is saying about why it's important?
It's largely what you just said, that this the thought behind it is, it is twofold. It's first to put agency leadership closer to the lands that it manages. And that's certainly something that sounds like it makes sense. It also, I think the flip side of that is some people worry that, leadership belongs in DC where policy decisions are being made, and that they then make decisions and translate that information down to the forests, which are managed locally. But the other argument for a lot of these changes, a lot of the closing of regional offices and closing of research stations where leaders and research stations are, is that it'll make the Forest Service more efficient, and that there will be savings in that it'll get rid of some redundancies. And so I think on the surface at least, it's this focus on efficiency, and then moving closer to where the people are, where the forests are.
Which sound like admirable goals, but
Yeah.
but you write that there has been confusion and concern sown by these moves. So when you speak to former Forest Service employees who are connected to the agency, what do you hear from them? I mean, where is that confusion and concern coming from?
I mean, I think there was the Bureau of Land Management. So BLM did this in the first Trump administration, moved headquarters from DC to Grand Junction, Colorado. And most people who were given the opportunity to move quit instead, because they live in DC and they're humans with families and spouses and lives, and they either couldn't or didn't want to uproot and move to Grand Junction. And so what the end result was a massive loss of institutional knowledge when a whole bunch of people quit. And so I think that's one big concern, is that when you start shuffling folks around, there's a lot of people that aren't going to shuffle because they can't, or they don't want to. And so then you'll lose a lot of expertise that way. And the other concern, I think, is that the Forest Service is, as we just talked about, but in this sort of weakened state, from a lot of cuts and a lot of disruption to begin with. And so then this is just one more thing that's going to cause a lot of confusion. I think that way, that there's just, how is this going to get done, and are we going to lose even more people? So I think there are a lot of unknowns right now.
Yeah, I just want to read from your reporting that it says that the Grand Junction move, the Bureau of Land Management move, it opened the new office in 2020, and only 41 of the 328 BLM employees that were expected to move west actually did. So a huge amount of loss of human capital there and knowledge. So let me talk to you a little bit about this movement of offices into the states, because up until this point, the U.S. Forest Service had been overseen by these 9 regional offices. And going forward, Washington State, where I'm speaking to you from right now, we are going to get our own forest management office. We're one of 15 states that will. This is a big change, obviously. How did it come about, Christine?
The original reorganization plan, which didn't have a ton of detail in it, but had called for just closure of regional offices. And I think there was a lot of concern there that then there would be policy that comes out of the White House, comes out of Congress and DC, and now I suppose Salt Lake to some degree. But there would be this high level policy, and then it would go straight to forests without some interpretive level in the middle. And that would make it, harder to be sure that forests were complying with national directives, would be harder to be sure that everybody was essentially on the same page. That was a lot of what these regional offices did, that they acted as an intermediary to be sure that everybody was kind of aligning with what the directives were nationally. And so now there's the state-based model, and I think there's, folks aren't sure exactly how this will go. It could work like the regional offices did in some ways. It resembles much more the way that BLM is managed. BLM has a lot of state-based offices, and I don't know if that's part of the thinking, that they'll go to that model. I know the Forest Service has for years now, but especially more recently, has been focusing a lot on partnering with states to manage forests. Utah recently signed a really big agreement to have essentially all of their national forests, all their I think 8 million acres of national forest in Utah to be to some degree co-managed by the state and the feds in this like cooperative working agreement. And so I don't know if that's part of the thinking too, that these state offices then will facilitate better management between states and the feds locally. That would be my best guess from what I have heard.
What's the concern about turning over power to the states here? Is there one?
The biggest concern is that the multiple use mandate will be harder to follow through with, I think. That states, different states can have very clear priorities, that some states may be much more extractive in their focus, that they want to do a lot more logging and thinning, but especially commercial logging of forests, and that other states might be much more interested in perhaps conservation or preservation, or opening up a lot more to recreation. But I think the concern is, and I can see it argued both ways, that working with states is a good way to have local priorities be a part of forest management. But I think it also, the concerns from folks that I have heard on the ground is that it may give undue influence to state leaders that might want a future for forests that doesn't really align with the national forest mission. And so I think that's a concern that right now, forests are managed nationally by the federal government. There's this broad multiple use mandate, and it's hard because there's always different uses that people want, right? There are different priorities. And if there's a lot more state management, then there could be a lot more focus on state priorities versus this harder line to walk national focus.
What is the situation with the research stations? Because you write that there's one in Fort Collins, Colorado, that's going to stay open, but many will be closed, including one in Portland, Oregon, that does a lot of work with spotted owls. What's going on there?
As far as I can tell, especially the Portland office, there's a lot of leadership in the Portland office. So one of the things that they've said, and Forest Service has said in this announcement, is that they're planning on moving all the research station leadership to Fort Collins. So there will still be research labs open. So Corvallis, for example, is a big research lab in Oregon, and that will stay open. But the leadership portion of it is going to be moved to Fort Collins. And what that means is we'll kind of see how it goes as it unfolds. I think that's another thing that may make some sense as far as efficiency goes. But when talking to people who've worked in those offices, say, well, that's local leaders are important, and it's important to have local leadership helping shape what we're doing here. So I think that is the idea, is again efficiencies, getting rid of redundancies, and so we'll just close all these offices and move whoever we need to Fort Collins, and presumably a lot of folks again will probably quit because they're not going to want to move.
What have you heard from tribes in all of this? Because they do a lot of work with states and the federal government on managing forests. Are they speaking about this issue right now, the plans to consolidate a lot of these offices, moving the headquarters of the U.S. Forest Service to Salt Lake City, closing the research stations? Are you hearing anything from indigenous groups?
Yeah, I reached out to a number of folks who were chatted with me some, but were a little reluctant to talk on the record at this point. Just wanted to see how it starts to play out. But there were a lot of tribal comments on the initial proposal that came out, and the big themes from those were this concern of moving headquarters to Salt Lake, and that meant that it was just it's more cumbersome to get a hold of who you need to reach than that right now. When all headquarters are in DC, or congressional leaders are in DC, Bureau of Indian Affairs, like everybody's in DC. So you can buy a plane ticket, you can go there. It's like a one-stop shop to get a hold of everybody you need to. And now this adds another level of complexity. And the other real concern was that tribes have been building relationships with people that work at the Forest Service, work in USDA, and have built those relationships for a long time. And if if there is kind of a mass purge, if there's a lot of people that quit, that's a lot of institutional knowledge gone and a lot of relationships that are gone, and that makes life harder.
I'm talking with Christine Peterson, who wrote about the upcoming reorganization of the U.S. Forest Service for High Country News, announced last week by the Trump administration. Christine, just to be clear, we've been talking a lot about how forests are managed when it comes to timber, when it comes to recreation, disease, threatened species, things like that. What about firefighting? That's a huge issue for us here in the West. Will there be some kind of impact on firefighting capacity, resources, personnel because of this reorganization?
They say no. So it wasn't part of the formal announcement, but there was a call with Forest Service leadership to everyone who works for the Forest Service. And in that call, they were very explicit that none of this will impact for firefighting personnel. So, as we know, there's a lot of changes going on in the way that fires are going to be fought and the way that agencies work together. But the Forest Service said that there's not going to be a change to firefighting staffing, firefighting personnel.
I will just say that we also heard that about the DOJ cuts and also the voluntary separation policy. Mm-hmm. And there was confusion about what firefighting personnel actually looked like in the Forest Service. Right. For example, when those DOJ cuts were announced, they said, no, this won't touch any firefighting resources. But in fact, a lot of the people who were on leave or got cut ended up doing wildland firefighting, had their red cards, could be called up for different jobs. Right. And so there just wasn't a lot of vision in the department on what those cuts would actually mean for firefighting. I'm just putting a pin in that because, Again, we've had this kind of conversation before about changes and not realizing the downstream effects on firefighting.
Right. No, that's a great point. The bulk of the people who work for the Forest Service, certainly a lot of people who work for the Forest Service have their red cards, and they end up getting called in to work as backup, to work as support, especially when there's really big wildfire seasons, which we are likely to have this year. And that when it becomes an all hands on deck situation, that's when a lot of these people that maybe aren't classified as firefighting staff end up working in really important firefighting roles. And what that's going to look like, we're going to have to see, I suppose.
Christine Peterson, science, environment, and outdoor recreation writer who's been covering the reorganization of the U.S. Forest Service for High Country News. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. Don't forget you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org or on your favorite podcast app.